What if the most powerful financial dynasty in Asia didn't disappear because it failed, but because the world chose to forget it? When people talk about dynastic wealth, one name dominates the conversation: the Rothschilds. A European banking family whose influence became legend, myth, and controversy. But history quietly hides another story, one just as vast, just as influential, and arguably more global in reach. A family whose capital flowed across oceans, whose decisions shaped empires, and whose legacy was gradually erased from public memory. They were once called the Rothschilds of the East. Today most people have never heard of them. Who were they? How did they rise? And why did history slowly look away? The answer is not a conspiracy. It's more unsettling than that. To understand it, we must go back to a world where money traveled faster than law, where empires outsourced power to merchants, and where finance quietly replaced flags as the true ruler of the world. In the early 19th century, global trade was undergoing a transformation. Europe was industrializing at a speed history had never seen. Factories demanded raw materials. Cities demanded labor. Governments demanded revenue. And one problem threatened the entire system: trade imbalance. Britain, the dominant imperial power, imported massive amounts of tea, silk, and porcelain from China, but China wanted little in return. Silver flowed east and Britain was bleeding wealth. This imbalance terrified policymakers. The solution that emerged would reshape Asia forever: enter private merchants. Not armies, not governments, but families. Among them was one dynasty that would rise faster and fall quieter than almost any other: the Sassoon family. Often described by contemporaries as the Rothschilds of the East, the Sassoons built a financial empire that stretched from Baghdad to Bombay, from Shanghai to London. They controlled shipping lines, banks, insurance firms, real estate, and trade networks that linked 3 continents. Yet unlike the Rothschilds, their story is rarely told. That omission is the mystery. The Sassoons did not begin as global titans. Their origins were precarious. In the late 1700s, the family lived in Baghdad, then part of the Ottoman Empire. They were part of the Baghdadi Jewish merchant class, a small but influential community engaged in regional trade and finance. For generations, they served as intermediaries between empires fluent in languages, cultures, and currencies. But politics turned violent. In the early 19th century, persecution and instability forced the Sassoons to flee Baghdad. Everything they had: status, protection, property, vanished overnight. This was not a rise born of privilege. It was a rise born of displacement. David Sassoon, the family patriarch, arrived in Bombay with little more than connections, experience, and an understanding of something far more valuable than money: how empires actually worked. Bombay was not yet the financial hub it would become. But it was positioned perfectly. A port city under British control, close to trade routes, and hungry for intermediaries who could operate where imperial bureaucrats could not. The British Empire needed merchants willing to take risks it could not officially endorse. David Sassoon understood this immediately. He began trading textiles, cotton, and regional goods. But soon, a far more lucrative opportunity emerged, one that would define the family's rise and stain its legacy: opium. Britain's solution to the China trade imbalance was brutally simple: sell opium grown in India to Chinese markets. It would reverse the silver flow, finance imperial expansion, and stabilize the British economy. The problem? China banned it. So the trade moved into legal gray zones operated by private firms, insulated from direct state responsibility. The Sassoons were perfectly positioned. They built warehouses, shipping fleets, financial instruments, and distribution networks. They did not invent the opium trade, but they industrialized it. Cause and effect followed swiftly. As opium flooded China, silver flowed back west. British coffers stabilized. Private fortunes exploded. The Sassoon Empire expanded at breathtaking speed. By the mid-1800s, the Sassoons were no longer merchants. They were architects of a financial system. They established banks that financed trade, insurance firms that protected shipments, and real estate empires that reshaped port cities. They funded railways. They influenced colonial policy through economic necessity rather than political office. Unlike European banking dynasties that lent money to governments, the Sassoons controlled the arteries of commerce itself. Their power was operational, not symbolic. In Shanghai, they built trading houses that dominated waterfronts. In Bombay, They constructed institutions that still define the city's skyline. In London, they integrated seamlessly into elite society. And yet they never fully belonged anywhere. This outsider status would become critical later. At the height of their power, the Sassoons embodied a new kind of empire, one without borders. But every system built on imbalance carries the seeds of its own collapse. The opium trade provoked resistance in China, culminating in the Opium Wars. Though Britain emerged victorious militarily, the moral and political costs were immense. Resentment simmered. Nationalist movements grew. At the same time, global finance was changing. The late 19th century saw the rise of corporate capitalism. Family-run trading empires began giving way to joint stock companies, state-backed banks, and centralized financial institutions. The very flexibility that allowed the Sassoons to rise now became a liability. They were too global for nationalism, too private for regulation, too visible to remain untouched. The breaking point did not arrive as a single collapse. It arrived as erosion. As colonial systems weakened, nationalist governments sought to reclaim control over trade. Opium, once quietly tolerated, became politically radioactive. Public opinion shifted, moral scrutiny intensified. The Sassoons attempted to adapt. They diversified into textiles, real estate, and manufacturing. They distanced themselves from opium publicly. But history had already begun rewriting their role. They were no longer seen as facilitators of trade. They were framed as symbols of exploitation. At the same time, rising anti-Semitism in Europe and Asia made their position increasingly precarious. Unlike Western banking families embedded in national institutions, the Sassoons lacked a single homeland willing to protect them. When World War I and II reshaped global power, their decentralized empire fractured. Assets were nationalized. Trade routes collapsed. Political alliances dissolved. The family did not vanish, but their system did. The fallout was subtle and therefore complete. Unlike dramatic financial crashes, the Sassoon decline occurred quietly. Their companies were absorbed. Their buildings remained, but their names faded. Their influence dissolved into corporate structures that no longer carried family identities. History textbooks focused on empires and wars, not merchant networks, and so the Sassoons were slowly erased. Not because they were insignificant, but because their story challenged a comforting narrative that governments rule history. In reality, markets often lead and states follow. Now consider the modern world. Today, less than 1% of the global population controls more than 45% of global wealth. Multinational corporations generate revenues larger than most countries. Supply chains determine geopolitics. Sanctions weaponize finance. Capital moves faster than law. The pattern is identical. Private systems grow in the gaps between states. They stabilize economies, then they destabilize societies. And when collapse comes, history rarely names them. It abstracts them. The Sassoons were not heroes. They were not villains. They were a product of a system that rewarded profit without accountability and then punished visibility without nuance. Their erasure teaches us something uncomfortable. Economic power does not guarantee historical memory. In fact, it may ensure the opposite. 3 takeaways emerge from this forgotten dynasty. First, finance shapes history long before politics acknowledges it. By the time governments react, systems are already entrenched. Second, moral reckoning arrives late, but it always arrives. Wealth built in ethical gray zones carries long shadows. Third, those who operate between nations are powerful only while nations tolerate them. When the rules change, intermediaries are the first to fall. The Sassoons were not erased by failure. They were erased by transition. Here is the open question their story leaves us with. When today's financial empires fade, when platforms, funds, and global corporations dissolve into history, who will be remembered? And who will quietly disappear? Their influence hidden beneath neutral language and forgotten footnotes. If this story changed how you see money, power, and history, engage with it, like the video. Subscribe for deep historical investigations. And ask yourself, by the late 19th century, the world that had allowed the Sassoon Empire to flourish was beginning to turn against the very forces that created it. The global economy was no longer driven only by merchants and ships. It was becoming institutional, bureaucratic, and increasingly nationalized. Governments that once relied on private families to move capital and manage risk now wanted control. Finance was being pulled inward, absorbed into the machinery of the state. For a family like the Sassoons, whose strength came from operating between borders, this shift was dangerous. Their power had never rested on armies or flags. It rested on access to ports, officials, credit, and information. But access is fragile. It depends on trust, and trust depends on political stability. That stability was breaking. China, humiliated by decades of foreign domination, entered an era of nationalist awakening. The opium trade, once framed as a commercial necessity, became a symbol of national trauma. Chinese reformers, intellectuals, and revolutionaries no longer saw merchants as neutral intermediaries. They saw them as accomplices. At the same time, Britain faced moral pressure at home. The empire could justify conquest, it could justify taxation. But justifying addiction became increasingly difficult. Public discourse shifted. The opium trade moved from unfortunate but necessary to embarrassing and indefensible. This change did not immediately destroy the Sassoons, but it poisoned the soil they stood on. They responded the only way they knew how: diversification. The family expanded aggressively into real estate, textiles, shipping insurance, and industrial manufacturing. They funded infrastructure projects. They became patrons of education and philanthropy. They attempted to rebrand themselves not as traders but as builders of modern Asia. In Bombay, Sassoon-funded buildings became landmarks. In Shanghai, their offices dominated the Bund. Their architectural footprint was immense. But architecture cannot erase memory. The economic tide continued to turn. As the 20th century approached, a new force emerged: corporate capitalism. Shareholders replaced patriarchs. Boards replaced families. Scale mattered more than relationships. Compliance mattered more than discretion. The Sassoon model, centralized family control with decentralized operations, began to look outdated. Meanwhile, their identity became a liability. They were Jewish in a world sliding toward anti-Semitism. They were foreign in societies demanding national ownership. They were private in an era demanding transparency. And they were wealthy in a century that would repeatedly punish visible wealth. Then came the wars. World War I shattered global trade routes. Empires collapsed. Borders hardened. Financial networks that once spanned continents were suddenly trapped inside hostile jurisdictions. Assets were frozen. Contracts voided. Trust evaporated. The Sassoons survived, but only by shrinking. World War II was worse. Japanese occupation of Shanghai dismantled the family's Asian stronghold. European anti-Semitism intensified. Capital fled. Properties were seized or abandoned. The very decentralization that once protected them now prevented unified defense. By the time the war ended, the world had changed beyond recognition. The age of merchant dynasties was over. After the wars, the Sassoons did something unusual for a once dominant financial dynasty. They did not fight to reclaim their former position. They dissolved into the system. Some family members integrated into British aristocracy. Others moved into art, science, and philanthropy. Their companies were absorbed into conglomerates. Their banks merged. Their properties remained, but without their name attached. There was no dramatic collapse, no scandal, no bankruptcy headline, just quiet disappearance. And this is why history forgot them. History remembers conflict, not absorption. It remembers revolutions, not transitions. The Sassoons did not fall like empires. They were absorbed by modernity. Their story reveals a truth that still unsettles economists and historians today. The most powerful financial actors are often erased, not because they lose, but because their function becomes inconvenient to explain. It is easier to tell history as a struggle between nations than to admit that private networks once shaped global outcomes more than governments did. This pattern did not end with the Sassoons. Today, multinational corporations operate across borders with revenues exceeding national budgets. Investment funds influence housing markets. Supply chains determine diplomatic behavior. Sanctions weaponize banking systems. Private platforms control information flows once regulated by states. Just like the 19th century, power lives in the spaces between jurisdictions. And just like then, the moral consequences are delayed. Consider this: the top 0.01% now control wealth comparable to entire regions. Corporations legally shift trillions through tax havens. Financial crises repeatedly socialize losses while privatizing gains. When these systems eventually fracture, history will likely repeat itself. The institutions will be blamed. The governments will be criticized. But the private networks that shaped outcomes will fade quietly into footnotes. The Sassoons are a warning, not a myth. They show us that economic power without political anchoring is temporary, that moral ambiguity accumulates interest, and that history is written not by the most influential, but by the most narratively convenient. 3 final lessons remain. First, financial systems do not disappear when exposed, they dissolve when replaced. Second, moral accountability is rarely enforced in real time. It arrives generations later, stripped of names. Third, the families and entities shaping today's global economy may one day vanish from public memory, not because they were small, but because their role is too uncomfortable to remember. So here is the question this story leaves behind. When future historians explain our era, whose names will they omit? And will we recognize ourselves in what they choose not to say? If this series changed how you see money, power, and history, support it. Like the video. Subscribe for deep financial history. And remember, the most powerful forces shaping the world are often the ones history quietly erases.